Let's call the meeting to order, and the next bill for our consideration is Senate File 142, Carbon Capture and Sequestration. Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, bring you Senate File 142. Let me explain just a little on the origin of it, and then talk about why, a little of the history of development of the bill, and then take you as rapidly as I can through the basics of the bill. Mr. Chairman, it really started at a meeting of this Joint Interim Committee, the Corporation's Interim Committee, last meeting of the year, 2 years ago. The people that owned the Big Muddy oil field in the Glen Rock area came and gave a glowing report. If you all, I think most of you were probably there, but they gave a glowing report of the advantages to the state if they could do a CO2 tertiary recovery in that oil field. And I volunteered, I spoke up and said, that sounds great. If you have barriers that you need removed, come let us know and we can do something about that. And they promptly wanted to see me the next day because they were finding barriers. So that's what touched this effort off. It was a bill, the budget session was prepared and not brought because it was a sudden change in the circumstances we couldn't adapt to in a 20-day session relating to what the feds were doing to another power plant. And it made the bill not work. So this one was developed over the course of this year, and let me go through the reasons that I thought the bill was a good idea, want to bring it, and I think we ought to pass it. First one is the estimate that we have received, and it was done by the people that owned the Big Muddy field, and it was based on what a 20-year project would do in their field. The estimate is that the state and local governments would get $1.2 billion additional revenue. This is after taking out what they were already going to do in the field. It took a while to get that all the way out of the estimates. $1.2 billion over a 20-year project at $65 a barrel oil. And that figure gets my attention. That figure would be somewhat front-loaded. These projects are, so it'd be more in the first years and less in the outer years. So that's the first piece that got my attention. Second, concerned about reliability of our power grid as we lose the dispatchable power that we can turn on and off as we need it, and preserving the power plant there that is scheduled for abandonment in 2027 will improve the reliability, help the reliability of the grid. Third, it looks to us like carbon capture is a profitable byproduct. And so we want to make sure that there aren't increases to future ratepayers to pay for putting it on. It ought to be done by the private sector in expectation of recovering their costs through a profit, not from raising rates. And on that same note, there is no state subsidy in here for private activity. This depends on it being attractive to private investors. It will preserve a number of jobs in both at the power plant. It'll create some jobs in the neighboring oil fields that use the CO2. It will help preserve jobs in the coal mining industry, help preserve some of the coal mining industry. So it's important to Wyoming on that score. And it will give the oil industry a second supplier of carbon dioxide. And, Mr. Chairman, I think that's important. The CO2 that's now being used in tertiary recovery in a number of oil fields in the state, including most successfully the Salt Creek field in my district, is coming from the Chute Creek plant on the LaBarge platform. It is a byproduct of the production of natural gas methane and helium, and is therefore subject to fluctuation depending on those markets and the capacity to serve those markets. And one supplier, which is also in the oil and gas business, so theoretically competitors to some of the others, we think having a second source supply is useful, and it is expensive to transport CO2 great distances. That's why the 1.2 billion estimate of revenue to state and local governments is based on the Big Muddy oil field, because I'm told it's right next door to the power plant. I'm told the distance is actually 6 miles. So they're the logical customer there. Why are we doing it right now? We're wasting a valuable resource, letting the CO2 go up the stacks when it could be recovered and used to produce a valuable product in Wyoming. And I think ultimately there may be more demand for CO2 than is going to be otherwise available. So we're going to recover a resource that may well not be recoverable, or not be recoverable when it's needed. The market conditions are favorable right now to doing it on a private enterprise basis rather than any kind of state subsidies. And there are some federal subsidies involved that were increased in a bill that the Congress passed in August. Those are time limited, and goodness knows how long they will really last. So this is an appropriate time to move, and we are wasting things if we don't move now. Developing the bill, a bunch of us from Natrona County and Converse County's legislators, particularly Converse County, and the Converse County commissioners met with the incumbent utility involved at the plants that are likely to be involved, is the Dave Johnson, and also covers the Jim Bridger plant, but that's retirement, it's further away, so there's less discussion of that. And our ask of the incumbent utility was, tell us, we know you've got problems with the West Coast regulators overusing any kind of coal, but tell us what we could put in the bill to make it more palatable to you. And we offered, our understanding of current utility law is that if they get a profitable byproduct, and we think what this is going to be, that the profit has to go to reducing rates entirely. We think in getting it done, there ought to be an incentive for the power company. And we said, look, we can change that part of utility law. Our initial suggestion, which you'll see in the bill, is 50-50. But we suggested that to them. There was agreement reached at that meeting. They would get back to us. That meeting was 5th August. The suggestion was they'd get back to us first week in September. They put that off to second week in September, and then they put that off to the first week in October. We had a subsequent meeting. Because of elections, some of the legislators changed. And at that meeting, I asked them twice very bluntly, what are your suggestions to make it more palatable? And the basic response was, don't do it. So I've had to write the bill on the assumption that the utility is not particularly favorable to it, and you have to stop the things they might do to stall the project. And that is the assumption behind the bill. Going through the bill very rapidly, you have a set of definitions, and then on page 6 of the bill, you have a section that is guidelines to the state agencies, particularly the Public Service Commission. In implementing this, it looks a bit like a purpose clause, but it really isn't. This is where we've put the guidance to the state agencies, and that's important so that you don't have unconstitutional delegations, and it's important in terms of making things come out right. So it was easier to do it once up front, Mr. Chairman, in drafting, rather than repeat it 5 or 6 times through the course of the bill. And I would just highlight a few of those things. We're going to talk about carbon capture. That's some of the first things. You're talking about on page 7, line 18, 19, and 20, you're enhancing the revenue, state of Wyoming, its political subdivisions through existing taxes, leases, and royalties. Incidentally, it turns out we own a significant portion of the Big Muddy oil field that's the logical customer because they're so close. And those lands were selected as in lieu lands because they were good Platte River bottom land. And then we found the oil, or entrepreneurs found the oil. And the state, I won't say the state was smart, but it pays for the state to be lucky, and they were lucky. We want to cover at the top of page 8, make sure that the decommissioning and reclamation costs are covered. And that's super important because you're talking about an expensive investment to put the carbon capture in, and nobody's going to touch it if they think they might get liable for a cleanup that can potentially be very expensive. We want to improve the reliability of the grid. I mentioned that. We want, on page 8, lines 8 and 9, you see the preventing the carbon capture from causing material rate increases. I think there'll be some small rate increases due to administrative costs, but we don't want significant rate increases for electric customers. And we mentioned the retaining the employment opportunities for Wyoming residents. You have, going through the bill, you have the reclamation decommissioning cost section on page 9. This was something I hadn't initially intended to put in the bill, but I started hearing horror stories as to what was going on. Talked to both the Department of Environmental Quality and the Public Service Commission, and both of them were relatively optimistic that things were under pretty good control there. But I had wrote the bill on the assumption we didn't know and had to find out. So you'll see at the end of the bill, there's a study that this has some bonding provisions with grab the bond quickly so the resources can't disappear with the retirement. And then have a process for taking a look at did we get too much or not enough. That's in there. Ask the PSC to find out how much has been recovered in rates and make sure that that's available to us. That's in there. You going beyond that on page 19, you start a series of provisions that ultimately wind up in a forced sale. You worry about them saying, well, we won't give it up, we'll just let it sit and deteriorate, or run it at a very low level and let it deteriorate. That's equivalent to our minds of closing. You have a provision there that deals with that. You have Then a series of provisions that do relate to a forced sale with a priority for carbon capture given. Those provisions they start on page 19. They go over on page 27 to a section 27, lines 12 through 16, where you have a minimum bid, which shall not be less than the net salvage value of the facility or unit. And, Mr. Chairman, that's a taking of private property. And the 14th Amendment provides, if we do that, they have to get value for it. They have to get their full value. And with that value is the salvage value of the plant, because you're going to, otherwise they're going to retire it. That's what's left. That's what they're going to get if we do nothing. So we have to give them that. And there is a major precedent for this, Mr. Chairman. In the early 1980s, railroads were going bankrupt all over the United States, particularly the Northeastern Third. The feds responded by passing a thing called the Staggers Act, and railroads had been very much price regulated, very similar to the way we price regulate electric utilities. And one of the things was they weren't being allowed to abandon unused facilities. The Fed said, okay, you can go ahead and abandon, but you have to be willing to sell at net salvage value. And that was based on the Fifth Amendment, where the language on takings is almost identical to the 14th. So that's a good precedent. It's been happening on quite a scale for all these years, 40 years now. And it has worked. So that's the concept we're relying on, very parallel circumstances, Mr. Chairman. The page 30, you have modifying the law as talked about, so that there's a profitable byproduct, the operator of the power plant can split that with the ratepayers if it's regulated. 50-50 split. On page 31, we have given some, in the sale process, some other things, we've given priority to using the carbon capture for enhanced oil recovery, because that's where the state's big financial interest is. And there's some penalties for promising that that's what you were going to do and getting the priority and then not following through and doing it. We'll put a charge on the amount you sequester or otherwise, or that you release to cause to be released to the atmosphere. I suspect that will be self-executing, but I think it's important to have it. On page 33, if we're selling the power plant, you have to make the primary product, the electric generation, viable. And there's a list of ways you can sell it, including back to the grid, including to large industrial customers. And we would rely on the federal law on the transmission there. And there's a number of others, some duplicates in there, which is fine, I think. They can use it for the carbon capture itself. That user can use it. There's a series of them there. And then on page, starting I think on 37, you've got 38 rather, you've got some conforming amendments to the previous laws we've passed, and basically what this does is one of the public service commissioners told me, it rides on top of what we've already done. And we had to do some things to make sure that we didn't have an inconsistency in there. I think we've achieved that, Mr. Chairman. And then you have the studies, starting on page 41. The main one is asking Department of Environmental Quality to study the reclamation, make sure that we have got that right. And it's a two-stage thing. Preliminary report due 1st of October of this year, basically based on what they already know. Write it up and tell us. And the concept is if they need to do further work, which they may well, to be sure about that. At that point, they would tell us if they need any appropriation in order to do that, which they may. And then a final report on July 1st of next year. And if they have to do expensive work, they will bring us a definition of that at the preliminary report, and we might have to extend that deadline. That'd be a possibility, Mr. Chairman. Similar structure for a study by the Consumer Advocate's Office of if power companies are going to ignore the possibility of putting carbon capture on plants that continue working and therefore keep electric rates high, should we change the rates so that they can't, that's taken into account and the rates are lowered according to what they could have earned. Have a look at that. That's a little longer term proposition, but it has the same time structure on. There was a question, Mr. Chairman, about the burden on the Public Service Commission. There will be a significant administrative burden. They can talk about that. My judgment is they have some time on that. There's some provisions in here where they can do an assessment, which will wind up back in the rates to cover that. And fundamentally, Mr. Chairman, if they're right, if the burden is somewhere in the $1 million range, that's $1 million with the potential return of 1.2 billion. That's a good gamble for us. That's worth it. But I think we do have to recognize that's a possibility. I think it can be handled through the assessment mechanism, and they'll eventually need an appropriation, and they can either use the B11 process for it if they need some of that earlier, or bring it through the regular budget process next year. I think either method would work, Mr. Chairman. I don't think we know enough at this point to really ask for an appropriation, and I don't think it would be appropriate. I would mention, Mr. Chairman, one amendment that did come to me in time to look it over. There was some concern about we were reaching out and getting to facilities that really can't take a carbon capture. And the advice I had early in this process was that if you get too much under 300 megawatts, you don't have the economies of scale to make it profitable. That the feds may have changed that with their subsidies, may have got it lower, but we've stuck with 300 megawatts. And on page 4 in the definition of coal-fired electric generating facility, on line 15, I would recommend that after facility, we insert the words containing a unit of 300 megawatts or more nameplate capacity, so that facilities that don't have a unit that big are not covered by this, because it looks like that the carbon capture would be uneconomic on those. So that's a recommendation I will make. Mr. Chairman, I've taken too much time, but it's too darn complicated, just in the nature of the beast.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Scott. I know you've worked very hard on this. So let's see if there's any questions from the committee at this point. Any questions for Senator Scott? Senator Scott, were you going to have some help on the direct presentation, or should we open up to the
This-
agencies?
I think I'll be happy on the direct presentation.
Okay,
I'll be happy to answer any questions. I've tried to take it through you as quickly as possible. I don't want to talk the bill to death. And I know it's a complicated bill, but
okay.
I would suggest public testimony unless the committee members have some questions.
I was thinking of starting with our state agencies that are affected. So I think we'd start with the Public Service Commission and then go to the OCA. I guess DEQ would be involved too, so on deck. Good to see all you. Just not much is happening over at the PSC today. I think you guys had to cancel an open meeting, didn't you?
Mr. Chairman, we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Welcome to all of you. Please help us out.
Good afternoon, Chairman, members. I'm Chris Petrie, Chairman at the Wyoming Public Service Commission. With me today is Commissioner Mary Throne and our Chief Counsel, John Burbridge. This is a very significant bill, and it has significant implications for not only the goals and purposes that are described in the bill, but also for the Public Service Commission, potentially for electricity ratepayers in the state, and for the utilities and other interested parties as well. I certainly appreciate the importance of the stated policy objectives that Senator Scott has described and that are contained in the bill. I don't see any of those as necessarily inconsistent with the purposes of the Wyoming Public Service Commission's regulation. We're out to make sure that there's safe, adequate, and reliable service available at just and reasonable rates throughout the state. And I do, though, have some areas I'd like to highlight that are concerns with the bill.
Go ahead.
First, it is not perfectly clear that this bill would operate in harmony with the existing laws that have been in place in the last several years. And I'm specifically thinking, or primarily thinking of the results of Senate File 159 and House Bill 200. Senate File 159 was a requirement that utilities attempt to sell coal-fired power plants that would otherwise be retiring before they do so. And the other, House Bill 200, was the law that established the reliable, dispatchable, low-carbon power requirements for the state. And we don't have any SF 159 proceedings currently underway. We have gone through a rulemaking process and elaborated on how that will work within the commission's rules. House Bill 200, same thing, a very extensive rulemaking process. We have, since concluding that, received applications from the two big investor-owned utilities that it applies to. And those proceedings remain underway. We expect to get results from both those companies' RFP efforts. Those are out right now, and we expect their second filing in the spring, in March. So we are going through that, and there is some uncertainty about how this meshes with what we would be doing under this new proposal. And there are some specifics that we can get into, and I'm going to defer that to Commissioner Throne. After I finish up here, she'll have some details on where there are particular concerns with meshing the provisions.
Sounds good.
The most prominent issue here to me is that there's a potential impact to Wyoming customers of imposing a bonding requirement for decommissioning and reclamation. Public utilities that operate generation facilities in the state are regulated so that when they begin operation of a generation facility, they begin collecting through rates depreciation, which includes the costs that are anticipated for decommissioning and reclamation. Of course, at that beginning, your ability to estimate those accurately is a little loose, and you're talking about 40 or 50 years off into the future. So you have to manage that as you go through the life of the plant, and you have to make adjustments along the way with the intention and the objective of making those two factors meet: the amount that you've collected through rates to fund the decommissioning and reclamation, and what it's actually going to cost. So as you get closer to the moment of truth, so to speak, you have a better idea, and your adjustments can be made on a kind of a finer basis. The intention, of course, is that you'll recover all the costs that the decommissioning and reclamation will involve through the rates by the time the plant ceases operation, or by the time the plant ceases operation. If that doesn't occur exactly, it would still be paid whatever the company's prudently incurred expenses might be. We would pay our fair share, and by we, I mean ratepayers of Wyoming. Ratepayers of Wyoming would pay their fair share of those expenses, even if it did extend beyond the actual operational life of the plant. That's a little bit peculiar in the utility regulation world, but that's what we anticipate in the case of a closing plant, because you can't necessarily get it exactly right. If we were to have collected more than necessary, that would be dealt with in rates as well.
And then, Mr. Petrie, our fair share, why don't you explain to us how that comes about? Is that the multi-state protocol?
Mr. Chairman, that is an aspect of the multi-state nature of the utilities that we have that are operating these plants. And if you want to talk about the big utility, Rocky Mountain Power, that is a portion of the multi-state protocol. Essentially, the way it works is those expenses that are deemed system expenses that serve the whole operation, like a coal power plant would, or a big transmission line would, those are divided according to the respective loads of the states. So there's 6 states involved with Rocky Mountain Power and Pacificor receiving service from Pacificor, the parent company, and its operating divisions. And so you pay proportional to the amount of cost that your portion of the load imposes on those system needs. So that's what I mean by our fair share. These days, I believe our approximate share is somewhere around 15% or 16%, Mr. Burbridge. This whole exercise is somewhat complicated by changing the retirement dates or the retirement plans for these plants. So if you're going along through a 40 or 50 year period, and then there's a decision or an intention expressed to change the end of the operating life of the plant, then very likely that requires you to adjust the rate that you collect the depreciation at. And those adjustments have been made across time, and they're yet underway. The other thing is that some states have indicated that they would like to cease involvement with the coal-fired power plants. So you have to sort that out so that those states pay, and their customers pay their fair share, and that there's no mechanism by which Wyoming customers would end up being responsible for anybody else's fair share of retiring these plants. So the idea being that there shouldn't be any way for Wyoming customers to take on any decommissioning and reclamation expenses that would rightly be paid by the customers in other states who have enjoyed the service associated with those generation plants.
But if the plant had a longer life, for example, the contribution of those other states would probably, well, it would depend on lots of political factors, but we could expect that they wouldn't want to pay for that. Would that be accurate?
Chairman, that's my impression of the state of things. I believe that several other states that are involved with this system, with the larger Pacific Core system, would not be interested in involvement with additional investments that would extend the useful life or the operating life of the plants. Yes.
And so, and Senator Scott, this is kind of a key to this whole thing. If the plant is truly sequestering CO2, it should rise above the standards, and maybe we could get participation from other states. Is that the theory, Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, not quite. If the other states require the power from that plant, then they've got share, obviously. If they do not, and not willing to take it, then we have to ensure a market within Wyoming for the power, which we believe will be quite inexpensive as these things go. And
Did you say inexpensive?
inexpensive,
Yes, sir.
because these plants are heavily depreciated. And Mr. Chairman, we're expecting, in addition, that putting the carbon capture on, given the level of the federal subsidies and given the price of oil, is going to be profitable. And that will change the calculus too.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Appreciate that. And let's go back and get it to the PSC and kind of think about that in that way.
Thank you,
Back to
Mr. Chairman. So I'm not aware of any indication that we should or have cause to expect a situation where a utility operating a coal-fired plant in this state would be unable to meet its obligations to conduct its decommissioning and reclamation activities. There's a special thing about public utilities compared to a lot of other business entities. That is that they're not permitted to leave. They have obligations. They've assumed obligations to continue to serve. In balance to that, we're legally obligated to see to it that they recover their prudently incurred expenses and that they have a fair opportunity to earn a return on their investment. Not a guarantee of anything, but for prudent expenses and an opportunity to earn a return, we're obligated to reimburse them or compensate them. And so as long as the utility continues to operate, it has revenue, and we're pretty confident of the financial wherewithal of Pacific or Rocky Mountain Power. And we're pretty confident that we're not too far off the mark on the depreciation, the portion of depreciation that's been collected to satisfy the reclamation and decommissioning expense. And so the concern then is that requiring bonding in addition to this regulatory arrangement would potentially place some very significant costs. And I am not an expert on the cost of bonds of this sort, but my understanding from the information I have been able to gather on that is that it will not be trivial. It will be a significant expense to bond any of these coal facilities at the the $1 million a megawatt capacity level. And so the problem with it is that the other states are very unlikely to see it as a benefit or as a system type of expense. They're likely to see it as something that Wyoming wants for its own reasons, and that they therefore don't care to pay any extra for. And so there's a real danger that those extra expenses, if they came to be, would be the burden of ratepayers in Wyoming, and that it would be really difficult or maybe impossible to share any of that cost with ratepayers in other states, because their commissions are likely to look at it and likely to be to hear the argument that this is not necessary given the arrangements that already exist under the normal depreciation over the operational or useful life of the plant. So careful consideration is warranted around the thought that we should impose a bonding requirement on these facilities.
Senator Scott, were you trying to get? Go ahead.
Couple of points, Mr. Chairman. One is that the figure I've gotten, the size of the bond, came relatively out of thin air. That's easy to modify if the committee thinks that should be greater or lesser. And maybe it should be lesser, but we don't really have any I don't really have any basis beyond that. Second, part of the reason for the bond is that a fear that the utility will find a way to put what they've already recovered for reclamation into their owner's pocket back in Omaha, and then stick Wyoming ratepayers going forward for the reclamation costs, and that the bond was intended in part to prevent that scenario. So those things, we've got to get a clear understanding of what the costs are, Mr. Chairman. But those were the concerns with the utility that is gradually removing its facilities other than the distribution lines and distribution system from the state, closing its power plants here. We were concerned about the ability to reach the utility and get them to pay.
Yes, and Senator Scott, as we're going down this and the people can address it, it's like trying to wrap my head around the fact that we share this plant with 6 other states, and 5 of the 6 other states may not like what we're doing. There may be some federal legislation, I suppose, that kind of helps if sequestration really does rise to the level playing field of a renewable. And then we've collected money, the utilities collected money all along. What portion, how does that work? And if the plant moves to a new life, what do we do with that old money? And how do we generate the new money that we might need? And, this is just the things that, and if indeed that plant is a merchant plant, or it could be a utility plant or a merchant plant, I assume. If it's a utility plant, it could continue to operate sort of like it has, I suppose. And then there would be ratepayer implications of that. If it's a merchant plant, then we've got to gather in the rates and make sure that this money is there. So I'm curious, I'm all ears.
Mr. Chairman.
Your microphone, there you go.
Mr. Chairman, the concept in the bill is that we will specifically have the Public Service Commission identify how much has been set aside in the rate. And that gets put in the bond as something that is there as a minimum, so that can't disappear on us. Then, frankly, the concept I think we've enunciated is if that is insufficient, it's not fair to charge the future ratepayers for what was insufficient, and that the company ought to be responsible for that. If the testimony is right and things prove that the recovery has been adequate or nearly adequate, then that's not a big problem. If there's a big discrepancy, then it is a problem. And with regard to using the existing, if the existing plant stays operating, it can clearly substitute for some of the bond. There's an asset there we can get at. And the provisions really relate to the ability of the buyer and the seller to make a voluntary deal on how that works.
Okay, let's keep drilling down. We'll go back to the Public Service Commission and let Mr. Petrie continue and finish up if he needs to, and then we'll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll call that enough said on the bonding requirement.
Okay,
Just to say that that is a high level concern for us on behalf of ratepayers. We don't want to see any unneeded expenditures that risk being fully attributed to Wyoming on these system assets. This bill also places the Public Service Commission in several new roles, puts some new requirements on us in the reporting sense. I think you may hear further from DEQ about the potential for substituting the commission in some spots where there is reference to the Environmental Quality Council. And we have discussed that, and we think that's a sensible thing. One last bit, there is some consequence to reducing CO2 output that acts as a trigger in this bill. And just in a general sense, I'm a little concerned that influence on the dispatch of some of these plants puts us at risk of being accused of causing uneconomic dispatch as these plants operate within the market, such as it is structure in the West with the energy imbalance market and the day-ahead market. If those plants are restricted in their dispatch by pressures that we might apply by statute, then we would likely, or we would at least invite people in other jurisdictions, interested parties in other jurisdictions, to assert claims that we were interfering with the most advantageous dispatch of the generation resources and therefore should be blamed for and held responsible for the cost. And with that, I'd be happy to attempt to answer any questions, but I'd really be happy if Commissioner Throne could have a chance to get into the details about the potential conflicts with the existing statutes in our process.
committee? Good. Go ahead with Commissioner Throne. Welcome, Commissioner Throne, former colleague.
Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Case. I am Mary Throne, Commissioner on the Wyoming Public Service Commission. First, I want to applaud Senator Scott for all the effort that he has put into this bill and tackling a number of difficult issues. I don't recall that I ever had a bill over 40 pages, but I don't know that a member of the minority party could get one through, so I always took my bites in smaller pieces. But in any event, I also want to thank Senator Scott for spending about 3 hours with us on a Sunday evening before the session started to go through the bill. And we shared our concerns with him then. And I don't believe that in terms of workability, this draft addresses all the concerns. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but just as a quick refresher, as Chairman Petrie said, Senate File 159 passed in 2019. requires a utility to make a good faith effort to sell a unit prior to retirement. The statute is pretty detailed in what it defines as good faith, and also the term, what the commission must find before it approves a new purchaser. My concern with the structure of Senate File 142 is that it seems to contemplate not a competing system with Senate File 159. I know there's a cross-reference in this bill to Senate File 159, which is codified at 37.3.117, that they have to comply with both. I'm not sure how either the utility or us and a purchaser would comply with all. There are,
Can you give us idea of
Yeah.
a conflict?
well, one thing is the trigger, and admittedly, the trigger is in our regulations, and of course, we can change our regulations to, and would change our regulations to accommodate any statutory changes. But
Pardon me, Commissioner Throne, I think I have a bill up in appropriations. I might get our good friend, he hasn't done any work today, Senator Landon, to take it, and I'll be back as soon as I can. I'm just across the hall.
No problem. Thank you, Commissioner Throne. Please continue. We rudely interrupted there, but
Apologize.
that,
thank you, Senator.
you know, I'm used to Senator Case being, no, I didn't say that. He's never rude. And I know you put in a lot of work this morning, Senator Landon. I wasn't here, but I was listening.
Yeah.
So in particular, if you look at 37.3.117C, again, it specifically defines what's good faith. And then I think my more major concern is D, or E, 37.3.118E. So we have to make a finding that basically the purchaser has the wherewithal to operate a power plant. And we elaborated on this in our regulations. We went through an extensive regulation process under Senate File 159, which is found primarily in Chapter 3, Section 25 of our regulations, that provides for an independent evaluator to review offers. It also requires financial assurance. So as I read, basically from page 19 on to the end, it seems to me to relax somewhat the requirements that are in 37.3.117E with regard to the qualifications of the purchaser. And that's a concern. Also, the timing, this bill is triggered already. And admittedly, the timing under 159 is in our rules. We require an application from a retiring coal plant 24 months in advance of the date of retirement, because we think it's going to take that long to give them time to look for a purchaser, and then also, if they can't find one, for us to evaluate the retirement of the facility. It's not a quick process. There just aren't a lot of people out there with $400 or $500 million to invest in a carbon capture facility, and then the wherewithal to run a power plant. And we do have to protect the public interest. But this bill, as I read it, I think it's on page 19, is triggered right now because the notice is in effect based on any integrated resource plan submitted before July 1st, 2022. So the Dave Johnston power plant is proposed for retirement in 2027. So as we sit here today, that's 4 years' notice. So we're already into this bill. We also and I'll go through these quickly, Mr. Chairman. Senate File 21 was passed in 2020. That's 37-133. This provides authority to prospective purchasers of otherwise retiring coal units that they may sell directly to an eligible retail customer, such as the large Trona facilities was, I think, basically who we thought would possibly take advantage of that, somebody of that size. And the bill adds a subsection E to 37-133, or a subsection J, it's on page 39 of the bill, that basically just says, you know, there's an obligation to purchase. And I don't think the subsection J is consistent with the rest of what's in 133. Then you get to House Bill 200, which, as Chairman Petrie said, we're in the middle of implementing right now. We have applications, had preliminary applications from Black Hills, Cheyenne Light, and Rocky Mountain Power for their process that they're going through to comply with House Bill 200. I don't know, if Rocky Mountain Power, because that seems to be who we're talking about here, goes through under 142 and puts on carbon capture, makes a deal with Glenrock for carbon capture, does that mean they've complied with House Bill 200? That we just stopped the House Bill 200 process? They have to look at another unit because the unit that they've identified as a prospective unit, DJ4, is covered under this bill. I mean, to me, they're competing regulatory schemes. And certainly under House Bill 200, we have the ability to consider carbon capture for EOR as what we tell them to do. It was discussed in the hearing, and I need to be careful, and my chief counsel can shut me up if I go too far, because these are pending cases. But that's on the table in the House Bill 200 process that we have going on. Maybe the timeline doesn't work, I don't know. But that's in front of us now. To achieve the same objective under that scheme that I believe is the intent of this bill. And just some minor conflicts. I'll just point out one. Because really, Senator Scott, this is a long bill. If you look in the implementation guidance, for example, there is,
Where are you there?
I'm on page, why can't I find it? Maybe I'm in the wrong place, but basically, the desire that's stated in this bill that there be no material increase for the ratepayers. You may recall that House Bill 200 has a specific cap of 2% on what can be charged to the ratepayers. So to me, that's a little bit of a difference.
You have a question? Senator Boner, jump in, pardon? Are you good? Okay. Senator
Why can't I
Scott,
find that?
do you want to jump in?
I would jump in on one thing on that. One of the things that has happened is that since those earlier bills passed, the world has changed on us. At the time they were passed, carbon capture was going to require money from somewhere, ratepayers or somewhere else, a subsidy. Since then, the price of oil has gone up drastically, which makes them profitable. And you have the much larger federal subsidies that came in this year. So, Mr. Chairman, some of those things are to be expected, that this bill is answering more to current circumstances than the 1, 3, and 4 years ago.
So really, Commissioner, I'm curious about this crossover of not just House Bill 200, but Senate File 159. And I want to allow you to continue to finish up your thoughts, and then maybe we can drill into that just a little bit.
So, Mr. Chairman, I apologize, my sticky fell off, but the reference to material rate increases is page 8, Romanet 8. And so that is a little different than what you find in House Bill 200. And then way at the back of the bill, but again, my stickies did not stick, it talks about the ability to share profits on the part of the utility, share the profits from the sale of the carbon with their shareholders. And I think it puts a 50% number in. House Bill 200 also contains a profit sharing language, but requires the utility to petition us for profit sharing or sharing part of the revenue with the shareholders. That was put in House Bill 200 as an incentive for House Bill 200. And also the change in the federal law is very relevant to our House Bill 200 process. And in fact, we've given both applicants, both utilities, more time to evaluate the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act because they dramatically increased the tax credits for EOR and permanent sequestration. And so that definitely has the potential to change the economics in the House Bill 200 process. So we directed them to review that. At the time they filed their applications, the bill had just passed, the IRS guidance isn't out, et cetera. So they couldn't really give us that economic analysis with their first application. And I know we're taking a lot of your time, Mr. Chairman. I'll just make one other general comment. We had some concerns about some drafting issues, and if this bill moves forward, I can type those up. But sort of inconsistent use of terms like carbon capture customer versus carbon capture party. Senator Scott, in his change in the definition of unit versus facility, addressed actually one of my major concerns. If this bill is really intended to only apply to units of 300 megawatts or larger, we really have to be careful about mixing the use of facility and unit. Generally, you don't put carbon capture on a whole power plant. It's a unit by unit process. So I think we would want to go through here and make sure we're really talking about units. When you're talking about the bonding, obviously you bond on a facility-wide basis, but when you're talking about when the carbon capture requirement is triggered, and basically the 205, Section 205 requirements of this bill, if you're really talking about units of 300 megawatts or more, we need to make that clearer. But that's a drafting issue. We had some concerns with some of the definitions, but I don't really need to go into that detail. So I promised I'd share the workability concerns. Tried to do that. Maybe a little too general because my sticky system isn't working, but happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Commissioner Throne, thank you. And your offer to go through the bill, we would take that in a heartbeat. I do think that the cross-reference to a couple of bills that you've alluded to is important, and I think we're going to have to make sure the bill is structured properly on those fronts. So I'm sure that maybe I speak for the rest of the panel here. I think that would be very useful, very helpful. Senator Scott, did you have something? Anything? Rest of the committee? Okay, thank you, Commissioner Throne. I'm going to turn it back over to the chairman.
Thank you, Senator Landon. Thank you to the Public Service Commission. Let's hear from the other agencies, and we probably ought to think about how we're going to do this whole thing. I don't think we're going to do it in the next 25 minutes, okay? So what are all alternatives? We could come back tomorrow. We could come back, think about it. I want to think about it. In the meantime, let's hear from the Department of Environmental Quality. Welcome, Mr. Parfit.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Todd Parfit. I'm the Director of the Department of Environmental Quality. With me is Suzanne Ingalls, the Administrator for the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division. Also sitting behind us is Kyle Wentland, the Administrator for Land Quality, and Jennifer Zigmund, the Administrator for Water Quality. And they're just components that touch each of these divisions. That's why they're here. I did provide for you a handout with some suggested amendments, and I'll walk through that in detail as we go through this. So what I would like to do is start with page 8, line 23, in a suggestion to insert, nothing in this article shall be construed to supersede or alter the provisions of Wyoming Statute 3511, 313 through 320. And the reason for that is there are some definitions in this bill that are similar to definitions that we have in the rules that were part of our primacy package for the Class 6 UIC program. And we want to ensure that we don't unintentionally create a situation where we have a primacy question that we have to deal with EPA. So that was the first recommended change. The second recommended change is on page 10, line 9, and this is to insert after the word bond, including a professional engineer's bond calculation. And the purpose behind this is that if we're going to be reviewing, along with the commission, the sufficiency of a bond as contemplated on page 11 of the bill, we would want to have some engineering estimates that we would be evaluating against other standards to determine whether or not it's a sufficient bond. So that's the purpose behind that recommended change. And just to let you know, our initial read on the bonding requirements is that it would apply to at least 2 facilities covering 6 units, and there may be one other facility that's kind of questionable right now that we're not certain. But just to kind of give you a sense of what we think would be subject to regulation under this bill. Then I would just make a comment. The DEQ, Solid and Hazardous Waste Division, in consultation with the Water Quality Division, oversees the regulation and remediation of fly ash, hazardous waste, or other solid or liquid waste disposal sites associated with the facility. The DEQ, through the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division, currently is pursuing primacy under the coal combustion residuals rule with the EPA. And just for informational purposes, that primacy package will be submitted to EPA in 2023. So then that takes us to the next, and this will be common for the next 4 suggested edits. And the first one being on page 11, line 13. And we would suggest amending as follows. You would delete Environmental Quality Council and insert the commission in consultation with the Department of Environmental Quality. And the reason for this is the Environmental Quality Council, although it's a separate agency, is not the right agency. And I've talked with the EQC Executive Secretary, and he's in agreement that the EQC wouldn't be the appropriate entity. The Environmental Quality Council is a separate agency that has 2 primary functions. One is to hear appeals of DEQ actions, and secondly, to promulgate rules brought forth by the agency. So it's an agency with 2 FTE, an executive secretary and a paralegal, and then a council of 7 members appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. So that's just the background there.
Would you give the language again?
Yes,
Oh,
Mr.
it's
Chairman,
been handed out, I'm sorry. And the commission in this sense is who?
the Public
Public
Service
Service
Commission.
Commission. Just, okay, thank you very much. Keep going.
Thank you,
Sorry
Mr.
for
Chairman.
that.
So on page 11, line 20 is a similar change. Delete the Environmental Quality Council and insert commission. On page 17, line 16, the same. And then on page 18, line 4, again, the same amendment. Then that takes us to the back end of the Senate file, 142, in section 3, and this is on page 41, line 19. We would suggest either adding the commission in consultation with, or it could be the commission and the DEQ for developing the reporting, both the interim and the final reporting. And following along with that, if you were to make that change, then on page 42, lines 4 through 6, we would suggest deleting the Public Service Commission shall assist with the study if requested by the DEQ, because that would be unnecessary, because either the commission in consultation with DEQ or the commission and DEQ would be doing the report, so that would be unnecessary. The next suggested edit is the insertion on page 42, line 6, or line 4 rather, is there is appropriated $500,000 from the general fund to the commission to retain outside engineering services for the sole purpose of conducting the study, and any unused funds would be reverted to the general fund. Now, based on the conversation that we've heard today on the bill, as I understand it, that the draft report due in October would consist of what we know now. And that's something we can do with our existing resources. We wouldn't need engineering help to do that. And then we would also provide a cost estimate to complete the study, which would get into more detail on the costs associated with the actual decommissioning of a unit or the facility. And that's something that, our recommended change on page 42, that 500,000 is kind of a best guess. And if you looked at it, it assumes 6 units and senior engineering services at roughly $250 an hour. So that gives you 2,000 hours, which would be 330 hours per unit, which we think is a good swag anyway, in terms of what the cost might be. But if, as we understand it, that we would be able to come back with that first version of the report with a more detailed assessment of what the costs might be, and with the what the timing might look like to complete that study. We would just then request that that gets reflected if this bill were to move forward.
Senator Scott.
That's entirely accurate. The concept is we get the preliminary report based on what they know now, and then we'll have a much better idea of what is actually needed to complete a report and a better budget, and that's the appropriate time to ask for the budget rather than here. And Mr. Chairman, I would say, I think the recommendations on this pass out are entirely constructive and useful, and we ought to adopt them. Frankly, I put the Environmental Quality Council in there not knowing that the Public Service Commission had any expertise in this decommissioning area. And if the agencies involved think we ought to go back to the commission on them, that's fine with me.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Anything else? Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just 2 additional suggested edits, and that's on page 42, line 8 through 11. And again, if the bill moves forward with the recommended change on page 41 to say the commission in consultation with the DEQ and the DEQ, there would be no need for that line 8 through 11 on page 42, and we would recommend striking that the Department of Environmental Quality shall submit an accounting of costs, just because that wouldn't be necessary at that point. And then the last suggested edit is on page 42, line 15. We would suggest inserting after paragraph C, the commission and the DEQ would prepare the report and provide that to the Minerals Committee and to the Corporations Committee.
Okay. Any questions for the department? Do you have anything else?
Mr. Chairman, that's all we have, and yeah, we will be here to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, stand by. I suspect we're going to try to go to about 10 more minutes, everybody. So let's keep going with the agencies. Would the OCA like to address us on this bill? Or welcome. Love to have you. And then you guys, we just got to figure out when we're going to continue this discussion. So be thinking about that. Welcome.
Thank you.
We've never actually met, so please.
Good
Nice
afternoon,
to see you.
Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Anthony Ornelas. I'm the administrator of the Office of Consumer Advocate. In the room with me in the back, I have Shelby Hamilton, who's one of our general counsels. I will be brief in my comments. I know time is pressing and there's other parties that like to speak. I'd like to start off by, telling you that I appreciate the conversations I've had and opportunity to speak with the Public Service Commission, a few other interested parties in the room, and I support the comments that you've heard thus far and some of the suggestions. So I won't spend much time reiterating some of those. Overall, the OCA really does support the above all strategy that the state of Wyoming has adopted in order to meet our load and resource needs. And as a Wyoming native, understand the importance that the extraction industry plays in this state. So we are supportive of the concept that was first presented in the HB 200 and the exploration of a CCUS technology in order to try to maintain our coal-fired facilities and provide additional benefits through tax revenues and other means. However, with that said, there are a few aspects of Senate File 142 that do give me some initial pause. In some instances, this is caused by ambiguity or maybe a lack of understanding on my part, but also the potential for some unintended consequences or rate consequences for Wyoming ratepayers. So I'd like to take just a few minutes to go over a few of these and ask that you would consider these as part of this bill. I'll start just with definitions. Under 3718-201A Romanet 3, this names the Office of Consumer Advocate as a carbon capture party.
What page is that, sir?
Give me one second.
Yeah, I know it's the beginning, but
Page
Page
4, line
four.
4.
okay, thank you.
And I guess it is just unclear to me sitting here what that is intended to imply. Through our statutory requirements, we have the authority to intervene in any contested case, including the HB 200, including any CCUS applications that may come before the commission, any other disputes. We do often regularly involve ourselves and engage in rulemaking, so it is just unclear what it means to be a party to this particular.
Let's check with the author. Senator Scott.
To make sure they had the standing to come into these things and to make requests if necessary.
And I think that
Thank you, Senator.
they would argue that they do have that standing if
And then we can
in
just
any
take it out.
PSC proceeding.
That is correct. So I just wanted to get an understanding if it expanded our roles or obligations or the intent. So I do appreciate that, Senator Scott.
It might be good to take that out because there might be some implied things
Yeah.
above and beyond. But that's simple. Keep going, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I would direct you to page 5, line 6. This is also under definitions. It relates to marginal costs, and I appreciate the language that has been included in there. I think it's a good start on defining marginal cost and what costs are for the application of generating electricity versus a byproduct. I do raise one potential issue, though, and that would be the extent that a coal-fired plant is retrofitted with CCUS. There are certainly instances that have happened in the recent past where a coal-fired facility would have required some sort of environmental compliance facilities to be put on it in order to continue its operations. However, through integrated resource planning or other planning, a plant is scheduled to retire perhaps early in lieu of spending substantial amounts of money to install those facilities. It is likely, based on what I have understood from the HB 200 applications thus far, that the installation of CCUS would require very similar, if not identical, type of facilities that really don't change the outcome of the principal product of electricity or electrons, but is also required to allow the operation of CCUS and the capture of carbon dioxide. So there could just be a need for some delineation there to help the parties as we look at any applications or questions that come before this, the body.
Okay.
Second, I would point to 3718-202, which is the implementation of this particular bill.
What
And-
page?
Give me 1 second, I apologize.
It's okay.
It
Pages are,
begins on page 6.
thank you. Pages are faster for us.
Yes, sir. So my concern here is that it states that the commission shall seek to ensure that the decommissioning cost and reclamation costs by past activities are adequately funded and are not passed on to current and future customers. You've heard today from the commission and about how we do typically include these from a day that a plant is commissioned to the day it is retired and the rates that utility customers are paid. We do our very best to align these as accurately as possible. However, it is really infeasible to hit it right on the head. Inflation is one thing that it's really hard to account for. But we do periodically update these and do our best to align them with the rates that are currently being paid. So I'm just concerned with that particular clause. It could cause some potential taking issues if it really is intended to state that current customers are no longer allowed to pay for these costs, or future customers if there is some overlap between those required funding mechanisms.
Senator Scott?
Chairman, the intent is to make sure that the costs that have been incurred and should have been recovered already, if they're not passed forward to future customers. And I don't see why future customers should be held responsible for mistakes of the past.
Okay, let's keep going. So just by way of getting towards the end, I don't know how much time you need.
Just a handful more minutes. Chairman.
Okay.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So I would reiterate the commission's position. I don't think we have an immediate problem with that. I do think there could be a potential, though, where future customers, we do need to adjust those rates and have them pay for costs that were previously incurred but not yet recovered. So. So with the bonding, there's been a lot of talk about that as well. So in the interest of time, I won't reiterate most of it. I would say, however, that is a cause of concern from the OCA's perspective. Again, we are collecting those in rates. Any additional requirements, any additional costs, those are likely to be passed directly onto Wyoming ratepayers. Even in the instance of a Pacific Corp, which serves 6 states, those are most likely going to be borne exclusively by Wyoming ratepayers. So I just ask that we be conscious of that and any requirements on top of what we already include in the rates for ratepayers. The next part I just quickly like to touch upon is, and I don't have a page, but it's 3718-205. It talks about the output reductions and retirements of this. I guess, again, I'm a little concerned, perhaps confused about where this begins and ends. And the situation I'm thinking of is through the normal integrated resource planning process. As we've seen before in recent history, there are times where a public utility finds that the conversion of a coal-fired plant to a gas-fired unit is economic, in the public interest, and will continue the operation of that unit, but in a different fashion. This reduces, of course, the environmental impacts and has the added benefit generally of reducing rates for Wyoming customers. So it's just a little unclear how this section here would hamstring that integrated resource planning process in the future if utilities are not allowed to make those sort of decisions if they're found applicable and prudent. On the sale of carbon dioxide under 3718-106, I would just raise some concerns that it seems like it could be it will be a new undertaking for the Public Service Commission. It would put them in a place where they're trying to price and regulate what had previously been a unregulated commodities market with the sale of CO2. And so I just raised some questions, concerns on that. That would be a new venture for us. Moving real quickly into the last couple points, you do have some violation and penalties in there under section 107 of this, and I do appreciate that. I think that's an important case. It's unclear to me, however, I guess, where those guidelines were originally established. And I'm not yet convinced sitting here whether or not those are adequate and appropriate to ensure that Wyoming ratepayers never get stuck holding a bag if one of these projects do not pan out the way they were originally forecasted to. That is the case that we've seen in other projects around the country, and it's just a concern of mine that if we have a CCUS purchaser and customer, that they make commitments to the state that they uphold, and that none of that comes back to ratepayers in any way, shape, or form. The last point I would just touch on real fastly, because it directly relates to the OCA, is section 4. This requires the OCA basically to report to the committee and do a study on each utility that is found to perhaps maybe not utilizing CO2 appropriately, and to recommend a rate reduction to the commission. So this would be a new undertaking for the OCA. It would certainly require a new level of expertise that we currently do not have within the agency, and will have a fiscal impact, and we have included that in some of our numbers.
Kind of puts you in a different role,
It absolutely would.
more of
yes.
a regulatory role.
Yeah, absolutely would, and it would hit on a whole new level of expertise and facets that sometimes we don't touch, such as EOR and oil extraction and things of that. So we'd have to really consider all facets. Likely would certainly need some outside consulting experts. So I would also just then highlight the initial reporting deadline of October 23rd, which is just 8 months away. It is my strong suspicion sitting here that that'd be a very short report, indicating that we are advancing and trying to hire out the processes needed to do that. But with that, I will leave it there in the interest of time, but be happy to stand for any questions.
Okay, any questions for the OCA? So everybody, here's our choices. We've had a long day already. I don't think this committee wants to come back tonight. And so tomorrow in the morning, Senator Landon and I have judiciary. And then at noon, I'm guessing the legislature is going to go through noon and try to hit the road early. So then now we're on to Monday or Tuesday. We do have a bill we're already carrying on to Tuesday. We could meet on Monday at noon, Senator Scott. I looked at you.
Indeed, that'd be fine with me. I don't know how it sits with the rest of the committee members.
Well, probably not very well, but we.
Operations again? I think Monday works for me.
Monday at noon, kind of shoot for the same time. 12:30, we did that so people could grab some lunch, and so tentatively set it for 12:30 on Monday to continue. Want to hear everybody. Apologize for not getting farther along today, but we got to start. So thank you very much. Senator Bono.
Just, Mr. Chairman, if I can make a suggestion, if everybody has edits, if you could send those to us in writing, that'd be a huge benefit.
That'd be lovely.
It's terribly inefficient to sit here and go line by line. And so I just appreciate if anybody who has any edits, if they could go ahead and do that.
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea, and communicate with Senator Scott.
And Mr. Chairman, particularly the Public Service Commission, if they have concerns, that they're much more serious than I had understood that they were. They have concerns with the mesh with previous legislation. Tell us how to fix it.
All right, we'll see y'all Monday, 12:30.